All right, so hopefully you had a good break, that little 5 minutes there. We're going to finish out Unit 8 with some evidence of evolution being factual based on scientific research and experimentation. So we're on slide 34 here in your note packet. I told you at the very beginning of the unit I'd give you some evidence backing that evolution really has happened and continues to happen, and that species and populations continue to evolve as their environments change. So, the evidence that we have are these four pieces here, and I put it in order so that you can hopefully remember it really easily. That it spells out FAME, right? If you look at the first letter here of each word, so that's your acronym, FAME. We have fossil evidence for evolution, we have anatomical evidence, molecular evidence, and embryological evidence. There's a picture for each. We have some pictures of fossils over here in the bottom right. We'll go over in the slides to come. We'll break down each of these four pieces of evidence in a little more detail. Here's your anatomical evidence. It's structures that may be similar among different species. We'll look at those. Molecular is based on DNA, right? A molecule of DNA. There are some similarities across species that show us that evolution has happened and that we are evolutionarily related to different organisms. And then embryology is the last one, and that means the development of the organism. So while it's still in, trying to think of a different word, it's still in development, it's still forming in its very early stages. Those are called embryos. All right, on slide 36, let's start with fossil evidence. You are writing down preserved remains. So fossils are the preserved remains or traces of an organism that lived in the past. So the pieces of an organism, a lot of time the bones or shells, those are usually the harder structures that are able to withstand the test of time as they're buried underground. But not all organisms turn into fossils. If the organism is softer, think of maybe a jellyfish. There's no hard structures there. Not every organism actually turns into a fossil. And how is this connected to evolution? The fact that we can view fossils and that we can dig up, archaeologists can dig into the ground and go deeper and deeper into the ground to see older and older organisms that had lived in the past. This shows that life on Earth today is different from what was in the past, right? The top layer, you see the picture of the archaeologist there. The top layer is the most recent. You're going to see the most recent organisms buried underground. But as you dig deeper, you'll notice, or archaeologists have noticed, right? And this is the scientific evidence and proof that evolution has happened, but the organisms in the ground look different than the organisms that are alive today. Here's some fossil evidence continued, and we'll notice at earlier stages in Earth's history, I don't know if you've ever heard of Pangea, but when all the continents were one before they really broke apart and spread across the globe, we can piece the continents back together, and you'll notice through evidence that there are fossils that are similar from one continent to another. So that shows that when the continents were closer to each other and attached, that organisms were similar, but now that they're broken apart, the continents are no longer attached. Those fossils are just proof that organisms were living and thriving in those parts of the world. And then on the very bottom, I don't think you're writing anything here. Oh, you are. You're writing common ancestor. So what is a common ancestor? A common ancestor is an older, now extinct organism which over time developed into multiple different species. We talked about that. I think I brought it up in some of the classes that we have a common ancestor with monkeys and apes and primates overall, common ancestor from very long ago. But since that common ancestor, we have branched off, and that common ancestor is extinct, and separate species have developed from that common ancestor. They may still have some similarities, but they evolve very differently based on where they now live. We have a lot of anatomical evidence that evolution has taken place if we look at things called homologous structures. Here you're writing down the words structurally similar. It's bolded for you on the slide. And then you're also writing different functions. So homologous structures are body parts that are structurally similar. So we're looking at the bones. The bones are very similar in this image, from the human arm to the cat arm, showing related species, but they have different functions. So there may be a very ancient common ancestor between organisms that have created similar structures, and bone structures and bone layout is very similar amongst very different species, but those species have all separately evolved to have different functions for those limbs. Okay, so a lot of big words here. Homologous, we know, means, well, homo, that root word, means same. So same structures, same bone layout, but now they serve different purposes or functions, right? So how does that show us that evolution has happened? The evolution connection there on the bottom reads that this indicates that these species share a common ancestor, and that the related species were probably exposed to changes in their environments, which now caused different functionality of those limbs. Some more examples of homologous structures on slide 39. So you'll notice that the coloration highlights the bones that are similar. So structurally similar. The yellow bones across all 4 organisms show that there are similar structures in there. But looking at a human arm, a cat arm, a whale fin, a bat wing, although there may be very similar structures within those 4 organisms, those limbs all function very differently, right? They serve different purposes because we've all evolved separately and have adapted to the environments which we live. We're still continuing under anatomical evidence. So there's a couple pieces to the anatomical evidence section of this, right? Analogous structures are a little bit different than homologous. So analogous structures on slide 40, you're writing structurally not similar on the first line. And then you're writing same function. So this is a little bit flipped in comparison to the homologous structures. So analogous structures are body parts that are structurally not similar, but they have the same function. So internally, when you look at a bat wing, a bird wing, and a butterfly wing, they're pretty different internally, and structurally on the inside, they look pretty different. But from an outside perspective, we can look at all 3 of those organisms and say, yeah, they're all wings, and all of them function the same in helping the organism fly. So analogous and homologous maybe think of as opposites. Now, how does this support evolution? The presence of analogous structures show us that these species do not share a common ancestor, and that the different species probably developed similar adaptations over time because of where they live. So they don't have a common ancestor, but because they all have the similar need to fly, over time, the species has adapted and evolved in order to meet the needs of their environment. So they all function the same in being able to fly. And then here on slide 41 in your note packet, some examples of analogous structures. Right, take a look at how all of them are structurally different, but can have common function. So they're grouped a little bit strange here. So on the left, you're comparing the insect leg to the horse leg, both functioning the same, allowing the organism to walk and move around, but internally the structures are very, very different. In the middle, you're comparing the fish to the dolphin, both used to function to swim, right? Both organisms need to move through the water, but internally very different. And then the last one, we're comparing an insect wing to a bird wing or a chicken wing. Again, on the outside, They both serve the purpose and function to fly, but internally very different structures. So these are analogous. Pause the video here, take a minute or two, and work with the people at your table. No need to move around, and fill in whether these examples are analogous or homologous. All right, hopefully you had some time to talk about these examples and fill them in. Let's see if you got your answers correct. The first one would be homologous. The second one, those structures are homologous. And then the last structures are analogous. Pause if you need to, if you have any questions or want to talk it out a little bit further as far as why these are analogous or homologous. Okay, moving right along, we're looking at slide 43 in your notes, still talking about anatomical evidence. So far we've only discussed of the acronym FAME. We've talked about fossils. We're still on the anatomical piece because there's a lot to it. And then we've got two more, molecular and embryological evidence. So anatomical evidence, we did homologous and analogous. Now we have vestigial structures. So you're writing down the word vestigial. I think vestigial structures are super interesting. They are remnants of a body structure that had a function in an early ancestor. If the structure is no longer beneficial for survival, the likelihood of the offspring inheriting the normal form of the structure decreases. So we actually, as humans, carry several vestigial structures, things inside our body that may have historically been needed by our ancestors, but no longer serve a purpose to us. We'll look at some examples here in a second, but on this slide, you may know that you have an appendix in your body that once served a purpose, but no longer does, right? We can get our appendix removed because we don't need it. Some other examples of vestigial structures in other organisms. If you look at the snake here, they have some remnants of possible legs at one point that they no longer have. So through the course of evolution, they no longer need legs. The center, you have a whale with remnants of a pelvic bone that at one point they probably evolved from a common ancestor that had legs and a pelvis and was more of a land-dwelling creature, so living on land rather than in water. We have our coccyx, our little tailbone that really doesn't serve a purpose anymore. On your, on your study guide, you're going to be thinking about some vestigial structures and looking up some vestigial structures and seeing what purpose, learning about what purpose they may have potentially served in the past but are no longer needed. So there's a dew claw on a dog that is no longer needed. If you have any pets that have their dew claw removed, that was something that dogs no longer need. We said appendix goosebumps is another one. Wisdom teeth. And this little, I gotta look up the name of this piece right here. The corner of our inner eye shows remnants of a vestigial structure that we no longer use that is still present. Okay, I know it's a little bit vague on that, but it's part of your study guide to kind of look those things up. On slide 45, molecular evidence, last two pieces that show us that evolution has happened and continues to happen. When we look at our DNA, right, we learned about the molecular structure of DNA. Here you're writing the word relatedness on the first line. Actually, I think that's the only thing you're writing. You're writing the word relatedness. So all living organisms contain DNA and proteins, which is our molecular material. And comparing DNA and proteins from different species helps to determine relatedness, that we are related to other organisms when we look at the sequence of nucleotides in our DNA. Those A's, T's, C's, and G's can be very similar. The order of them, which codes for who we are, right, our traits and our genes, if those sequences are very similar from one organism to another, that's evidence that we probably have a common ancestor. On the bottom, it says more similar DNA sequences, the more similarity between the organisms. And the last piece of evidence is embryological evidence, a study of embryos. You are writing study of, well, you're just writing the word embryo there. Study of embryo development across different species. An embryo is an unborn or unhatched offspring in the process of development. You can see the image there to the right of a human developing from an embryo. Now, how is this proof of evolution? On the very bottom, it says embryos among different species can look similar at different stages of development, which indicates the presence of a common ancestor. Pretty interesting stuff when you study embryos. If you look at this is slide 47 in your notes, you'll notice the very early stages. I'll actually go back a little bit. The very early stages of embryo development, I bet you can't tell what organism this is going to turn into. It's pretty interesting to see that all of these embryos, although are very different organisms, they start out looking very, very similar. As time goes on and the organism develops a little bit further, you see that some changes start to happen. And then this third stage in the image really shows the organisms looking more like their final structure. So early on during development, you can see some remnants of some traits and some structures that are very common from one embryo to another. You'll see gill slits, gills in fish, present in reptiles, present in birds, and even present in humans in early development. And we know that we don't have gills as humans, so definitely some evolutionary evidence that we are related and have common ancestry, that our development starts off very, very similar. And then tails here, we all start off in development, in early development, having something that looks very much like a tail. Okay, and the very last slide I want you to try out, actually I feel like this one's a little bit out of order. This goes with molecular. I should have moved that. It's funny that it's in this space, but let's try examining the molecular evidence of these DNA strands. If you want to pause the video right now and give that a try with the people at your table to see which of these three organisms are most closely related. Which of these two organisms are most closely related to humans? Is the chimp more closely related or the gorilla? Do that by seeing how many differences there are between the sequences. And pause now. All right, who got it correct? Chimpanzees are more closely related to humans. When you look at the DNA sequences, there's a lot more similarities between humans and chimpanzees, which means we have a more recent common ancestor. As opposed to our relationship to gorillas, we have a much further back and older common ancestor, meaning there was or is relationship, but very long ago. We've evolved and have branched off more long ago, I guess you could say, from gorillas. All right. You are ready to move on. Please let the sub switch to the next slide so they can let you know what's going on for the rest of the block. I'll see you guys when I get back.